Pick up almost any ratchet made in the last 90 years. A Snap-on, a Craftsman, a Husky off the shelf at the hardware store, the one in the drawer in your garage right now, and turn it over in your hand. That round head, the compact disc of gears that lets the handle swing in a tight space and click the bolt forward a few degrees at a time, is very likely a direct descendant of a single patent filed by a single engineer at a single company in Chicago in 1934. That company invented the thing nearly every other company copied. For most of a century, it built some of the finest sockets and ratchets ever made in America. So good that one of the most famous names in tools secretly paid it to make their tools and never told anyone. Jay Leno called it an iconic American brand for decades. Mechanics who knew tools the way a chef knows knives kept it in their boxes and swore by it. And in 2021, the company that invented the modern Ratchet, that had been forged in Chicago through 2 world wars and the Great Depression, was sold to a conglomerate headquartered on the other side of the planet. Its inventory auctioned off, its machines sold, its soul packed into shipping containers. This is the story of SK Tools, the Chicago Ratchet King that conquered the inside of every toolbox in America and then quietly disappeared from its own. The story begins, like a surprising number of great American tool companies, with a war. In 1916 in Chicago, 2 men named Mason Sherman and Noah Grover Clove incorporated a company called the Sherman Clove Company. Chicago in that era was one of the great manufacturing cities on Earth, a dense forest of foundries, screw machine shops, and metalworking firms, fed by the rail yards and the stockyards, and the endless appetite of American industry. Sherman Clove was a screw machine company, which meant it ran the automatic metalworking lathes that turned out precision parts, cap screws, nuts, small machined components for other manufacturers by the thousand. And in 1916, with the First World War consuming Europe and America edging toward it, there was urgent demand for one kind of precision machined part above all others: munitions. Sherman Clove turned its lathes to the war effort, machining mortar shell housings in its plant on Harrison Street. The company was born, like so much of American heavy industry, in the business of making the metal objects a nation at war runs through. When the war ended in 1919, Sherman Clove did what the best of those companies did. It turned its precision back toward peace. And for the next decade, it became something that is central to this entire story, and that almost no one outside the trade understood at the time. It became a ghost. Through the 1920s, Sherman Clove operated primarily as a contract manufacturer. That means it built tools and parts that were sold under other companies' names. A retailer or a brand would come to Sherman Clove and say, "Build us a line of sockets. Build us these wrenches to our spec." And Sherman Clove, with its precision machining and its growing skill, would build them and stamp them with the customer's name and ship them out into a world that would never know who actually made them. And one of those customers in those early contract years was Sears, Roebuck and Company. Sherman Clove made tools for craftsmen. Sit with that, because it is the deepest irony in this entire story, and it will close a circle at the very end. The little Chicago screw machine company secretly built tools for what would become the most famous tool brand in American history. Before SK was ever a name a mechanic would recognize, it was the invisible hand. Behind a name, everyone would. It built someone else's empire first. It learned in the shadows exactly how good it could be, and how little credit a company gets for being the hands instead of the name. It would not stay invisible for long, and the thing that pushed Sherman Clove out of the shadows and into its own name was a catastrophe. If there is a Sherman Clove or an SK tool in your box right now, a ratchet, a socket, a wrench with that diamond logo, comment the word Chicago below. I want to see how many of you are holding a piece of this story. In the early 1930s, the Great Depression was tearing through American manufacturing, and one of Sherman Clove's customers was a firm called the Hinsdale Socket and Wrench Company. Sherman Clove had been making socket wrenches for Hinsdale on contract. Then Hinsdale, like thousands of companies in those years, went broke and collapsed, leaving Sherman Clove holding a large inventory of finished socket wrenches with nobody to sell them to and no name to sell them under. Most companies in that spot, in that economy, would have eaten the loss and moved on, or gone under themselves. Sherman Clove did something else. It decided to sell the tools itself, under its own name. It took the first two letters of its founders, S for Sherman, K for Clove, and in 1932 it created a tool brand, SK. The diamond logo with those two letters inside it went on to the tools. And for the first time, the company that had spent years building other people's brands began building its own. And here is the thing that turned a desperate inventory liquidation into the birth of a legend. The tools were good, genuinely, exceptionally good. The SK sockets had features that mechanics noticed immediately. Strong construction, walls tapered thin enough to slip into tight spaces where fatter sockets would not fit, and a distinctive, beautiful finish that contrasted polished chrome against matte. They looked like precision instruments because they were precision instruments, made by a company that had spent 15 years machining parts to tolerances that munitions and industry demanded. By the early 1940s, that quality had won SK a significant share of the entire American socket market. A company that had backed into the tool business through a bankruptcy was now a serious force in it. But the moment that defined SK forever, the invention that would outlive the company itself and spread into the hands of nearly every mechanic on Earth, came in 1934 from an engineer named Theodore Rueb. Rueb developed and patented the fine-tooth round-head ratchet. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what ratchets were before it. A ratchet is the tool that lets a mechanic turn a bolt without lifting the wrench off and repositioning it after every pull. A mechanism of gears and a spring-loaded pawl inside the head lets the handle swing back freely and then catch and drive the bolt forward on the next stroke. Before Rueb, the heavy-duty ratchets of the day had coarse mechanisms, few teeth, which meant the handle had to swing through a wide arc before the gear would catch and advance. In a tight engine bay, where there is no room to swing a handle, a coarse ratchet is nearly useless. You cannot move the handle far enough to make it click. Rueb's design packed fine teeth into a compact, round head. More teeth meant a shorter swing was needed to advance the bolt. The mechanic could work in a tighter space, click by tiny click, where no coarse ratchet could function. It was simple. It was reliable. And crucially, it was easy to mass produce. He received the patent in 1934, and that round head design became the cornerstone of SK's reputation and one of the most influential tool designs of the 20th century. Look at modern ratchets today, nearly 90 years later, and an enormous number of them are direct descendants of what Theodore Rueb drew in Chicago. The round head, the fine-tooth mechanism. SK invented the template that virtually every major competitor would build upon. They made the thing the whole industry copied. Through the 1940s and into the post-war boom, SK rode its quality and its ratchet to the top tier of American professional tools. The company supplied tools to mechanics and industry across the country. It kept innovating. Knurled base sockets, new ratchet mechanisms, eventually a rotating head ratchet patented in 1961. For the professional automotive mechanic, SK sat in the conversation with the very best American tool names. Not the most marketed, not the flashiest. But among the people who actually knew, the mechanics who could feel the difference between a precise tool and a sloppy one, SK was revered. The tools were made in America, forged and machined to a standard that earned them a lifetime warranty and a loyalty that lasted generations. And then began the long, slow process that would eventually carry SK across an ocean. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way these things almost always happen, through a chain of ownership changes, each one moving the company a little further from the people who built it and the place that made it. In 1962, SK and its manufacturing partner were bought by a corporation called Symington Wayne. In 1968, that entity was absorbed into Dresser Industries, a sprawling industrial conglomerate. And here, early, came a small detail that tells you everything about what happens when a craft company falls into conglomerate hands. Dresser, wanting to modernize SK's sockets, dropped the distinctive cross-hatch knurling pattern that SK's sockets had carried, the texture that helped a mechanic's greasy fingers grip the steel. To the people who ran the spreadsheet, it was a cosmetic update. To the mechanics who used the tools, it was the first sign that the people who now owned SK did not fully understand what they owned. Over the following decades, the ownership kept shifting through corporate hands, even for a time under the French tool company Falcom. Each owner had its own priorities, its own portfolio, its own reasons. And through it all, the SK brand kept making good tools in America, the institutional knowledge and the machinery carrying the quality forward, even as the names on the ownership documents changed. But a company that passes from owner to owner, none of whom built it, is a company slowly losing its center of gravity. The soul of a tool company lives in the continuity, the same people, the same place, the same standard, carried forward by hands that learned it from the hands before them. Every change of ownership is a small break in that chain. By the late 2000s, the chain was under enormous strain, and then the economy broke it. The financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 hit the industrial and automotive economy with brutal force. SK Hand Tool, the company by then, was already struggling. In the summer before the end, it stopped offering health benefits to its workers, a move that sent 70 union workers, Teamsters, out on strike. The plant in Defiance, Ohio, had ceased operating. Only a few workers were left in the Chicago facility. The company owed its primary lender around $9 million. The maker of the Ratchet that the whole industry had copied was running out of road. On June 29, 2010, SK Hand Tool declared bankruptcy. What happened next is the part of the story that for a moment looked like salvation, and it is essential to tell it honestly because it makes the real ending sting all the more. When SK's assets went up for auction out of bankruptcy, there were 5 bidders. 4 of them were Asian companies, and according to the people involved, those 4 were interested in buying only SK's brand name and its customer list. They would have taken the diamond logo and the reputation and the relationships and shifted the actual production of the tools offshore. They wanted the name, not the hands. But the 5th bidder was an American company, Ideal Industries, a family-owned firm from Sycamore, Illinois, best known for making the wire nuts that electricians use by the billion. Ideal stepped in, outbid the others, and bought SK. And Ideal made a promise that in 2010 sounded like exactly the rescue the brand needed. It vowed to keep SK American-owned and to produce American-made tools. By early 2011, SK was back in production, in a new facility in Illinois, the machines running again, the round-head Ratchet still being made in America. For about a decade, that promise held. It was not the old SK. The Chicago plant was gone, sold off, not part of the deal. The workers and the real estate had not come with the brand. But the tools were still being made in the United States, and to the mechanics who cared, that mattered enormously. The brand had been pulled back from the edge, and then in July of 2021, the rescue ended and the real fall arrived. Ideal Industries sold SK Hand Tools to Hangzhou Great Star Industrial, a tool conglomerate headquartered in Hangzhou, China. Great Star had been on an acquisition run through distressed and bankrupt American and Western brands. Shopvac, Aerofastener, the Pony and Jorgensen clamp names. Now it added SK, gaining all of the proprietary SK patents and designs, including the legacy of the round-head Ratchet that an engineer had drawn in Chicago 87 years earlier. The backlash from SK's loyal base was immediate and bitter. For mechanics who had stayed with SK precisely because it was an American-made alternative to the offshoring that had swallowed so many of their favorite brands, the sale to a Chinese conglomerate felt like the final betrayal. The phrase that went around was selling out to China. And what followed did little to reassure them. Inventory was auctioned off. Someone who attended the auction watched the entire SK tool inventory go under the hammer in December of 2021. The manufacturing equipment was reportedly sold off in November. The SK website began telling customers it was out of stock due to global supply chain issues. A strange phrase, customers noted, for a company that had just auctioned off its own inventory and its own machines. And the quality question that every mechanic feared became real and documented. Listings began appearing where the same tool was shown in a photograph stamped "Made in the USA," while the written description underneath said "Made in China." The lifetime warranty that had meant something when a broken tool was replaced by an American company with American stock became, as it has for so many hollowed-out brands, a question mark, a promise printed on a tool whose maker was now an ocean away. There is a fairness owed here, and the framework demands it be paid. Not every Chinese acquisition of an American brand is a death sentence. The most powerful counterexample is sitting right there in the same industry. Milwaukee Tool, owned by a Hong Kong company, was poured full of investment and grew into one of the strongest tool brands in America. A publicly traded company's headquarters address does not, by itself, determine whether it will honor what it bought. It is genuinely possible that Great Star could invest in SK and revive it. And it must also be said that by the time these sales happened, SK had been a struggling, repeatedly sold brand for years. There may simply have been no American buyer left willing to take it on. These are real and honest caveats, but the pattern, as it actually unfolded, followed the darker script. The inventory auctioned, the equipment sold, the Made in USA stamp quietly contradicted by the Made in China description. The silence from the company in the face of its most loyal customers asking what would become of the brand they loved. 3 years after the sale, the verdict among many of the faithful was blunt and grief-stricken. Manufacturing offshored, quality gone, SK is dead. Whether that verdict proves permanent or premature, the thing that made SK the Chicago company, the American hands, the unbroken line back to the screw machine shop on Harrison Street, that was gone, packed into containers and shipped away. Now return to the irony from the beginning, because the circle closes here, and it closes hard. SK began its life as a ghost, the invisible contract manufacturer that secretly built Craftsman tools for Sears, building someone else's famous brand before it had one of its own. It stepped out of those shadows, put its own diamond logo on its tools, invented the Ratchet the whole world would copy, and earned the devotion of the people who knew tools best. And then, decade by decade and owner by owner, it was pushed back toward invisibility, until the company that had once been the hidden hands behind a great American brand was itself reduced to a name, a set of patents, a logo, owned by people who had never machined a part in that Chicago plant and never would. Both stories, the rise and the fall, are the same story, told twice. A company that was the hands behind the name, that became a name worth revering, and that ended as a name with the hands cut away. The empire of the inside of the toolbox, conquered with one brilliant ratchet and a standard of quality that earned a century of trust, and then quietly, with an auction notice and a contradicted label, abandoned. The round-head ratchet that Theodore Rueb patented in 1934 is still in production, in 10,000 variations, in the hands of mechanics on every continent. The design won. It outlived the company that created it, exactly as the best inventions do, indifferent to who owns the patent, indifferent to which ocean the factory sits beside. A mechanic reaching for a round-head ratchet today is holding a piece of Chicago, whether he knows it or not, the same way that 90 years ago, a man holding a Craftsman socket was holding SK's work without knowing it. The hands behind the name. That was always what SK was, first in secret, then in glory, and at the end, in absence. The name on the tool is only ever worth what the hands behind it are worth, and somewhere along the way, the people who owned the name decided that the hands, the Chicago hands that had carried the standard for 100 years, were the part they could do without. If the story of the company that invented the Ratchet the whole world copied and then lost its own name overseas belongs on the record, subscribe, and hit the bell. We tell these stories one tool and one company at a time, before the only version left is the one written by the people who shipped it away.